Chapter 1. The Fateful Rescue. The rain had been relentless, an unyielding sheet of silver cascading from the darkened sky. It had turned the forest floor into a sodden mess of mud and tangled roots, making every step a battle against the elements. The storm had rolled in fast, and without warning, sending streaks of lightning through the sky, like jagged cracks in the heavens. The thunder came in heavy, booming waves, shaking the very ground beneath Elias Brennan's feet as he pushed forward through the underbrush, his boots sinking into the wet soil. His survival suit kept most of the water off, but the cold still seeped in through his gloves, his breath misting in the air despite the humidity of the jungle-like terrain. Elias wasn't supposed to be here. The dense rainforests of Orion were a treacherous place even under the best of conditions, and with a storm like this raging overhead, most sensible travelers would have long since sought shelter. But Elias had never been the type to turn away from a challenge, and more importantly, he wasn't here by accident. His ship's long-range scanners had picked up something unusual just hours ago, a distress signal, weak and fragmented, coming from somewhere near the river valley that cut through this stretch of wilderness. Normally, he would have assumed it was nothing but a malfunction, some lost signal from an old crash site or an abandoned outpost. But this was different. The signature wasn't human. Orion, for was technically uninhabited. It had been designated a Class B exploration zone by the Galactic Council, meaning that while the planet was rich in resources and potentially habitable, it had yet to be fully surveyed, and colonization was still years away. But if there was a distress beacon coming from here, it meant someone or something was in trouble. And Elias had never been the kind of man to ignore a distress call, especially one that carried the possibility of an unknown life form. He had followed the signal as best he could, tracking it along the river's edge, but the storm had made things difficult. The river had swelled with rainwater, its currents surging violently over jagged rocks and broken logs. The scanner on his wrist had flickered in and out, struggling to maintain a lock on the signal, but Elias knew he was close. He could feel it in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through years of deep space exploration, the same pull that told him when he was about to find something important. And then, over the roar of the river and the howling wind, he heard it. A sound faint, but distinct. A cry. Elias froze, his pulse quickening. It wasn't just the wind or the rain. It was something alive. He turned sharply, scanning the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement near the water's edge. At first, he thought it was debris, just another broken branch caught in the current. But then he saw it again, something struggling against the river's pull, barely keeping its head above water. His heart lurched. It was small, barely the size of a human child, but its movements were frantic, desperate. Without thinking, Elias bolted forward. He tore through the underbrush, his boots slipping on the wet ground as he skidded down the embankment. The rain pounded against his helmet, half blinding him as he reached the edge of the river, but he didn't hesitate. He ripped off his survival pack, tossed his scanner to the side, and plunged into the icy water. The current hit him like a hammer, threatening to pull him under immediately. The weight of his gear dragged against him, but he fought through it, his arms cutting through the water as he pushed toward the struggling creature. It was closer now, but barely. Its small body was being tossed like a rag doll in the current, its limbs flailing weakly as it fought to stay afloat. Elias swam harder, his muscles burning with the effort. The storm raged around him, the wind screaming through the trees, but he kept his focus locked on the creature. It was only a few meters away now. Then, just as he reached out, a massive wave surged forward, slamming into them both. Elias felt himself being dragged under, the world spinning as the river swallowed him whole. Cold, crushing pressure surrounded him, but he didn't let go. He tightened his grip on the small body, kicking against the pull of the current with everything he had. His lungs screamed for air, his vision blurred, but then finally his head broke the surface. He gasped, sucking in a ragged breath as he fought to stay upright. The creature was motionless in his arms, its body limp, but it was still breathing. He could see its chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. It was alive. Gritting his teeth, Elias turned toward the shore and began to fight his way back. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. The moment his feet touched solid ground, he staggered forward, half dragging himself and the creature out of the water before collapsing onto the muddy bank. For a long moment, he just lay there, chest heaving, the rain pounding against his back. His arms still cradled the small body against him, his mind still catching up to what had just happened. And then, as he finally lifted his head to get a better look at the thing he had just pulled from the river, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any creature. It was alien, undoubtedly so. Its body was covered in sleek, iridescent fur, shimmering in the dim light of the storm. Its limbs were long and slender, but not quite human, its fingers tipped with small, retractable claws. Its face was feline in structure, but softer, more expressive. And its eyes large, golden, and glowing faintly stared up at him with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. This was no ordinary cub. Elias had just saved something rare, something unknown, something that had no business being on a world like this. The creature blinked slowly, its small chest rising and falling as it let out a soft, weak sound somewhere between a whimper and a purr. Elias exhaled, running a hand through his soaked hair as he stared down at it, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Where had it come from? Why was it alone? And more importantly, what the hell had he just gotten himself into? Elias knelt in the mud, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared down at the strange creature he had just pulled from the river. The rain pounded against his skin, the wind howling through the trees, but none of it mattered. His pulse thundered in his ears as he took in the delicate form before him, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of what he had just done. The creature lay still, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Its fur, drenched and tangled with debris from the river, shimmered under the dim light filtering through the storm clouds. Elias had never seen anything like it. Its sleek body was built for agility, its limbs long but graceful, its fingers tipped with small retractable claws. It looked almost feline, yet its features were far too expressive, too intelligent to be mistaken for a simple animal. He hesitated before reaching out, pressing 2 fingers lightly against its throat, searching for a pulse. The skin beneath its fur was warm, far warmer than he had expected given how long it had been in the freezing water. He could feel a faint but steady rhythm beneath his fingertips. It was alive. Barely. A deep breath of relief left him as he sagged backward, dragging a shaking hand through his soaked hair. The creature let out a soft noise, somewhere between a whimper and a purr, its body twitching slightly as it shivered from the cold. Elias moved without thinking. He stripped off his outer jacket, wrapping it carefully around the trembling form, trying to trap what little warmth it had left. His survival instincts kicked in, years of training in the deep frontiers of space reminding him that hypothermia was just as deadly as any predator. "Hey, stay with me," he murmured, voice hoarse from exhaustion. He wasn't even sure if it could understand him, but the sound of his voice seemed to make it stir slightly. Its large, golden eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, locking onto his with something that sent a chill down his spine. It knew. Not in the way an animal recognized its surroundings. Not in the way a stray learned to recognize kindness. No, this creature looked at him with comprehension, with awareness. Elias swallowed hard. He had found something impossible. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself to his feet, cradling the small creature against his chest as he stumbled toward the tree line. He needed shelter. The storm wasn't letting up, and the last thing he wanted was for both of them to die out here after everything he'd just been through. His ship was still kilometers away, too far to reach in this weather. But he had seen a cave nearby, just before the storm had hit. It would have to do. His legs ached as he trudged through the mud, his grip firm but gentle around the fragile life in his arms. The creature made another small sound, curling closer to his body, its fingers twitching against his chest. Its warmth bled into him, and for the first time, Elias realized just how light it was. Too light. It was starving. Weak. A surge of protectiveness rose within him, unexpected but undeniable. He had no idea what this thing was, no idea if it was dangerous, but none of that mattered right now. Right now, it needed him. And Elias Brennan had never been one to turn his back on something that needed saving. Chapter 2. The Creature's Secret. The cave was dry, the rock walls rough but stable, shielding them from the worst of the storm. Elias set the creature down carefully on a patch of soft moss near the back, making sure it was still wrapped in his jacket before crouching beside it. The flickering glow of his wrist light cast long shadows along the walls, giving the space an eerie, otherworldly feel. For the first time since he had pulled it from the river, Elias got a good look at it. The creature's fur, now slightly drier, had a strange iridescent sheen, shifting colors subtly under the dim light. Its body was small, delicate, but its limbs were proportioned like something built for speed, for precision. Its ears long, almost fox-like, twitched faintly as it stirred, another soft sound escaping its throat. Elias exhaled, shaking his head. "All right, little guy," he muttered, rubbing his face. "What the hell are you?" At that, the creature's eyes opened again. Elias froze. The golden glow in its gaze wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. A soft, pulsing luminescence, almost like bioluminescence, radiated from its pupils. And then, as he watched, something even stranger happened. The glow shifted, patterns forming in its irises, intricate and fluid, symbols flickering across its gaze like a language written in light. Elias' stomach clenched. That wasn't normal. That wasn't natural. He had traveled across dozens of worlds, had encountered creatures of all shapes and sizes. But this wasn't just an animal. This was something more. His mind raced, recalling everything he knew about Orion 4. The planet was supposed to be uninhabited. Its only known life forms were primitive, barely above the evolutionary stage of early mammals. There weren't supposed to be sentient species here. There weren't supposed to be creatures capable of. The creature lifted a hand. Elias stiffened as he felt something, a presence, a whisper at the edge of his mind. It wasn't words. Not exactly. More like an impression, a sense of curiosity, of fear. The damn thing was trying to communicate. His breath hitched. "No way," he muttered, his heart hammering. The creature flinched at his reaction, its ears flattening against its head as it let out a low, mournful sound. Its body curled in on itself, as if expecting him to lash out. Elias' chest tightened. It was afraid. And that single realization changed everything. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to relax. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't attacking him. If anything, it was just as confused and terrified as he was. Carefully, he reached out, palm open, a universal gesture of peace. The creature hesitated, golden eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then, slowly, hesitantly, it uncurled from itself and pressed its tiny hand against his. Elias barely had time to react before another rush of sensation hit him, images flashing in his mind, fragmented and disjointed. A vast, towering city of crystalline spires, glowing under an alien sun. A ship, sleek and impossibly advanced, breaking apart in the sky. Fire. Smoke. Falling. The river. Him. The connection broke, leaving Elias gasping. He pulled back sharply, staring at the creature with wide eyes. It had shown him something. Memories. This wasn't just an animal. It wasn't some undiscovered predator or lost specimen. This was someone. A survivor. And whatever had brought it here, whatever had caused that ship to fall from the sky, was still out there. Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had thought he was just rescuing some lost cub. But now, he realized, he had stumbled onto something much bigger than himself. And if he wasn't careful, it might just cost him everything. Elias sat motionless, his breathing still uneven from the jarring sensation of the creature's memories bleeding into his own. His fingers tingled where their hands had touched, a phantom warmth lingering in his skin long after the connection had faded. The cave around him suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in as his mind reeled from the impossible truth staring back at him. This creature, this small, trembling thing he had dragged from the river, was not just an animal. It was intelligent, sentient, a being with thoughts, memories, and experiences he couldn't begin to comprehend. And more than that, more than just intelligence, there was something else, something deeper. It had shown him a ship, burning in the sky, breaking apart as it plummeted toward this world. A crash, a fall. It had survived something catastrophic, something that had stripped it from whatever life it had once known. And now, it was alone. A tightness settled in Elias' chest as he looked at the creature now, at the child before him. Its golden eyes were still wide with uncertainty, its small body curled in on itself, as though bracing for rejection. It had reached out to him, had tried to share its story, and now it was watching him, waiting, as if preparing for him to turn away in disbelief. But Elias had spent too many years in the fringes of space, seen too many things that defied logic, to dismiss this as a hallucination. He exhaled slowly, carefully shifting forward, keeping his voice calm and steady. "You're not from here, are you?" The creature blinked at him, its luminous eyes narrowing slightly. Then, hesitantly, it shook its head. Elias felt his stomach twist. He had suspected as much. but hearing the confirmation sent a cold weight settling over him. If this child wasn't from Orion, then where? And more importantly, how did it end up here? Your ship, he continued, keeping his tone gentle. It crashed, didn't it? The child's ears flattened against its head, and its body trembled. A soft, broken sound escaped its throat, one that sent a pang of guilt straight through Elias. He had seen enough suffering in his lifetime to recognize it when he heard it. Something terrible had happened to this kid. Elias ran a hand through his soaked hair, staring at the flickering glow of the wrist light against the cave walls as he tried to make sense of everything. If there had been a crash, that meant there had been a ship. And if there had been a ship, that meant there might have been others. Survivors. Or wreckage. His jaw tightened. He needed more information. He needed to find out where this kid had come from, if there was anyone else out there who might be searching for them. But even as his mind scrambled for answers, a much simpler, more immediate concern took priority. The kid was still shivering. It was cold, wet, exhausted, and probably hungry. All the questions in the universe could wait. Right now, Elias needed to keep this child alive. Moving carefully, he pulled his survival pack closer, digging through the emergency supplies until he found a thermal blanket. He unfolded it and draped it around the child's small shoulders, tucking the fabric in gently. The child flinched at first, but didn't resist, instead curling into the warmth, its trembling slowing just slightly. There, Elias murmured. That should help. He reached back into the pack, pulling out a ration bar. It wasn't much, certainly not the kind of food he imagined this kid was used to, but it was better than nothing. He unwrapped it and broke off a small piece, holding it out. The child hesitated, its golden eyes flicking between him and the food. Elias could see the wariness in its expression, the deep-seated fear of trusting a stranger. I know it's not great, Elias admitted, giving a small shrug. But it's safe. I promise. A long silence stretched between them before, finally, the child reached out with a delicate, clawed hand and took the piece. It sniffed it cautiously, then, with slow, deliberate movements, placed it in its mouth. Elias watched as the tension in its small body eased ever so slightly. Good. That was progress. He leaned back against the cave wall, exhaling as the weight of the night finally settled over him. The storm still raged outside, but in here, in this small pocket of shelter, there was an odd sense of stillness. He had come here expecting to investigate a simple distress signal. Instead, he had found a survivor. And somehow, he knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Truth Beneath the Stars. Morning came slowly, the storm finally easing into a dull drizzle as the first hints of sunlight filtered through the thick canopy outside. The cave was still damp, the air heavy with the lingering scent of rain and earth, but the worst of the night had passed. Elias stirred from his light sleep, his muscles aching from the uncomfortable position he had curled into against the rocky wall. He wasn't used to sleeping on the ground anymore. His ship's cot had spoiled him. But his discomfort was the least of his worries. His eyes flicked to the small form still bundled in the thermal blanket. The child had barely moved in hours, its breathing deep and steady as exhaustion finally claimed it. Now, in the dim morning light, Elias could see it more clearly, the strange, shimmering quality of its fur, the soft rise and fall of its chest. Without the frantic edge of survival looming over them, the child looked peaceful. Elias let out a breath, rubbing at his tired eyes. He needed a plan. He couldn't just sit here forever, waiting for answers to magically appear. He pulled out his wrist scanner, adjusting the settings until it picked up the faint energy signature he had detected the night before, the same one that had led him here in the first place. It was still there, though weaker now, pulsing faintly in the distance. If that was the distress signal, then it meant the wreckage of the child's ship was still out there. And that meant there was a chance, no matter how small, that they weren't alone. Elias glanced at the child again, his jaw tightening. He had spent most of his life running solo, keeping his distance from attachments that might slow him down. But this wasn't something he could walk away from. He had made a choice the moment he pulled that kid from the river. And now he was seeing it through. Moving carefully, he placed a hand on the child's shoulder, giving it a gentle shake. Hey, he murmured. Time to wake up. The child stirred, blinking blearily up at him. Its golden eyes, still hazy with sleep, flickered with a moment of confusion before recognition settled in. Elias offered a small smile. We're going to find your ship. The child stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, it nodded. The journey ahead would be long, and the answers they found might not be the ones they wanted. But for now, they had a direction, and sometimes that was enough. Elias kept his pace slow as they moved through the dense undergrowth of Orion, mindful of the small child trailing behind him. The morning mist clung to the trees like a veil, curling around their feet as they navigated the slick, uneven terrain. The storm had left the forest drenched, the scent of wet foliage and damp earth filling the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of distant ozone. Every few steps, Elias glanced back to make sure the child was keeping up, though he quickly realized that his concern might have been misplaced. Despite its frail appearance, the child moved with an uncanny grace, stepping lightly over roots and rocks without hesitation. Its slender limbs, though still weak from exhaustion, carried it forward with a natural ease, as if the terrain was familiar to it in ways Elias couldn't understand. The fur on its body had begun to dry, its iridescent sheen returning under the muted light filtering through the canopy above. Even now, with no spoken words between them, Elias could feel something unspoken passing between them, a strange, silent understanding. The wrist scanner on his arm pulsed with a steady rhythm, guiding them toward the faint energy signature still lingering in the distance. It wasn't far now, just beyond the next ridge. His grip on his blaster tightened instinctively as they approached, though he kept it holstered. If there was wreckage, there was always the possibility of danger. He had learned long ago that nothing in the frontier was ever truly abandoned not without reason. As they climbed higher, the trees began to thin, revealing the valley below. And then, finally, he saw it. The wreckage. It was partially buried in the earth, torn apart from impact, jagged pieces of metal jutting out from the soil like the bones of a fallen beast. The hull was dark, scorched from the crash, but even in its ruined state, it was clear that this was no ordinary ship. The structure was sleek, almost organic in design, its surface lined with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with residual energy. Elias exhaled slowly. He had seen a lot of ships in his lifetime, but nothing like this. Beside him, the child tensed. He looked down just in time to see those golden eyes widen, recognition flooding through them. It took a step forward, then another, its small hands curling into fists as it stared at the wreckage, its body visibly trembling. Elias had no idea what kind of emotions were running through the child's mind at that moment, but he didn't need to understand the alien language carved into the metal to know one thing for certain. This had been its home, and now it was gone. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair as he scanned the area. The wreckage looked stable enough to investigate, but that didn't mean it was safe. If the ship had gone down recently, there could still be active power sources, lingering radiation, or worse remnants of whatever had caused it to crash in the first place. He turned to the child, crouching so that they were at eye level. "We're going to check it out," he said gently. "But we have to be careful. Stay close to me, all right?" The child hesitated, then nodded. Together, they made their way down into the valley, the wreckage looming larger with each step. The closer they got, the more details became clear. Scorch marks streaked the ground where the ship had skidded upon impact. Entire sections of the hull caved inward from the force of the crash. Debris was scattered in all directions, twisted metal, shattered glass-like panels, fragments of what might have once been control systems. Elias knelt beside a broken panel, brushing his fingers over the strange symbols etched into the surface. The material wasn't like anything he had encountered before, lighter than standard ship metal, yet impossibly durable. This wasn't just some cargo vessel. This was advanced, far beyond anything human engineers had developed. The child stepped forward, its fingers trailing over the same markings. A deep sadness flickered across its face, its ears drooping slightly. Elias could almost hear the weight of memories pressing down on it. "This was yours," he murmured. "Not a question. A fact." The child nodded, its small hands tightening against the broken surface. Elias exhaled. "All right, let's find out if there's anything left we can use." They moved carefully through the wreckage, stepping over fallen beams and exposed wiring, searching for anything that might tell them what had happened here. Most of the systems were dead, burnt out from impact or fried by whatever had forced the ship down. But as they reached what had once been the cockpit, Elias' wrist scanner began to pulse faster. A faint energy signature. Still active. His gaze snapped to a partially buried console, its screen flickering weakly. He stepped forward, brushing away the dirt and debris covering its surface before pressing a few experimental buttons. The interface flickered, then stabilized. Data streamed across the display, but it was written in the same alien script as the markings outside. Elias had no way of deciphering it, but the child did. It moved beside him, golden eyes narrowing as it scanned the screen. Its small hands hesitated for only a moment before pressing against the console. The screen shifted, and then a holographic projection flickered to life. A figure appeared, translucent and distorted, its features elongated but eerily similar to the child's own. Its voice was garbled at first, but then the translation protocols kicked in, and words clear, precise filled the air. Final distress log. Our vessel was attacked. Unknown hostiles. Forced to make emergency landing on uncharted world. Survivors, minimal. If anyone receives this message, protect the child. They are the last of our line. The key to our people's future. The message cut off abruptly, static crackling through the air before the hologram flickered and died. Elias stared at the console, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. The child wasn't just a lost survivor. It was something more. Something important. Something worth killing for. Slowly, he turned to look at the child, whose small frame was trembling, its eyes locked onto the now dark screen. It understood. It had known, or at least suspected, what that message would say. And now, so did he. Elias clenched his jaw, standing to his full height as he scanned the horizon. If there had been hostiles, if someone had forced this ship down, then there was a chance they were still out there. Hunting. His grip tightened around his blaster. "Come on, kid," he said, his voice lower now, edged with something cold and determined. "We need to get moving. Because whatever had destroyed this ship, whatever had tried to wipe out this child's people, would come looking again. And Elias wasn't about to let them win." Chapter 4. A Legacy Among the Stars. They left the wreckage behind as the sun began to set, moving through the underbrush with silent urgency. The weight of the discovery sat heavy on Elias' shoulders, but there was no time to dwell on it. The child walked beside him, quieter than before, its golden eyes flickering with an emotion Elias couldn't quite name. Fear, hope, determination. They had no destination, no plan beyond survival, but Elias had already made his choice. He wasn't just going to protect this kid. He was going to find out who had done this. And then, he was going to make them pay. As the stars began to fill the sky above them, Elias cast one last look over his shoulder, toward the wreckage now lost in the shadows. A war had started long before he ever set foot on this planet. And now, whether he liked it or not, he was part of it. The universe had tried to take everything from this child. But Elias Brennan? He wasn't about to let it. The jungle stretched endlessly before them, darkened by the approaching night. The child walked silently at Elias' side, the weight of its lost home pressing heavy on its small frame. Every now and then, its luminous golden eyes flickered toward him, filled with something that looked like a quiet plea, desperate hope that he wouldn't abandon it like the rest of its people had been abandoned to the void. Elias exhaled, gripping the strap of his survival pack tighter as he kept his senses on high alert. The wreckage of the ship had told him enough. This wasn't just some accident. Someone had shot that ship down. Someone had wanted it destroyed, wanted its crew erased. The message they had found had made one thing terrifyingly clear. The child wasn't just any survivor. It was the last of its kind. And that meant it was a target. The realization twisted something in Elias' gut. He had spent most of his life as a lone traveler, drifting from one job to the next, never putting down roots, never staying long enough for attachments. But now he had one. And if the child was as important as that message claimed, then he wasn't the only one looking for it. They had to move. "We need to get off this planet," Elias muttered, half to himself. He glanced down at the child, who was still keeping pace beside him despite the exhaustion written in every step. "My ship's a few clicks west. If we get there before nightfall, we can be off-world before anyone knows we're even here." The child hesitated, ears twitching slightly, as if it could sense something in the air that Elias couldn't. Then, it spoke. For the first time. A single word, soft but clear. "Danger." Elias' blood ran cold. His instincts kicked in immediately. He dropped low, pulling the child down with him, scanning the dense foliage ahead. His fingers wrapped around his blaster, pulse hammering in his ears as he listened. The jungle had been alive with noise just moments ago, the chirping of distant creatures, the rustling of wind through the trees. But now, there was nothing. A silence too perfect, too deliberate. They weren't alone. Elias barely had time to react before the first shot rang out. A streak of red plasma tore through the space where he had been standing just moments before, searing a blackened hole into the trunk of a tree behind him. He cursed, yanking the child behind cover as more shots followed, each one precise, calculated. Whoever was firing wasn't some random scavenger. They were professionals, and they were hunting. Elias tapped his wrist console, activating the emergency beacon on his ship. A low hum pulsed through the device, confirming the signal. His ship would start powering up remotely, but it wouldn't take off without him. He had to get them there in one piece first. More shots rang out, forcing them to stay low as he scanned for a way out. The attackers were closing in. He could hear the faint crunch of boots against the wet forest floor, the shifting of weapons being reloaded. They weren't in a rush. They thought they had him pinned. They were wrong. Elias turned to the child, meeting those glowing golden eyes. "Stay close to me," he whispered. "No matter what." The child nodded, its small hands curling into the fabric of Elias' sleeve, a silent promise that it wouldn't let go. Then, without another word, Elias moved. He fired 2 shots toward the tree line, not aiming to hit, but to distract. In the half-second window it gave him, he grabbed the child and bolted. They tore through the jungle, plasma bolts scorching the ground behind them. The child clung to him, its small body surprisingly light as he weaved between trees, using the terrain to his advantage. His ship wasn't far now, just a little further. Then movement ahead. Elias skidded to a halt as figures emerged from the shadows, clad in sleek black armor, their weapons raised. Their helmets obscured their faces, but he didn't need to see them to know what they were. Bounty hunters. And they weren't here for him. The child tensed, its breathing quickening as it pressed closer to him. It knew. It had seen these kinds of people before. Elias gritted his teeth. "You want the kid?" he growled, leveling his blaster at them. "You're gonna have to go through me." The lead hunter took a step forward, tilting their head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, to Elias' surprise, they spoke. "You have no idea what you're protecting, human." Elias smirked. "Maybe not. But I know one thing." He adjusted his grip on his weapon. "I don't let people take what's mine." Without warning, he fired. Chaos erupted. The jungle exploded with light as gunfire filled the air. Elias moved like a man possessed, ducking and weaving between trees, his blaster finding targets even as he shielded the child with his own body. The bounty hunters were fast, but he was faster. Years of surviving in the fringes of the galaxy had trained him for moments like this. A bolt grazed his shoulder, searing through fabric and flesh. He hissed, but didn't stop. He couldn't. His ship was just ahead. The clearing came into view, the sleek, midnight black frame of his vessel standing like salvation itself. The ramp had already lowered, the engines thrumming with life. Elias didn't hesitate. He sprinted up the ramp, nearly throwing the child inside before slamming the controls. The ship's systems roared to full power, sealing the hatch just as more shots pounded against the hull. He stumbled into the cockpit, fingers flying over the controls as the ship lifted off. The engines surged, the ground falling away beneath them, and then they were airborne. Elias exhaled sharply, muscles aching as he leaned back in his seat, heart pounding. He turned to look at the child, who sat curled in the co-pilot's chair, its golden eyes wide but steady. "We're safe," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The child stared at him for a long moment. Then, it did something he never expected. It reached out, not physically but mentally. A soft presence brushed against his thoughts, like a whisper at the edge of his mind. Not words, not exactly, but a feeling. Gratitude, trust, and something else. A promise. Elias swallowed hard, rubbing a hand down his face. "You really are something, kid." The child tilted its head, then, slowly it smiled. Elias exhaled, staring out at the endless stretch of stars ahead. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, he had a purpose. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He was a protector. And he wasn't letting anyone take this kid from him. Not now. Not ever. With a final glance at the planet shrinking behind them, Elias punched the controls. The stars stretched, the universe bending around them. And they disappeared into the vast unknown.